So, hello. Good afternoon. I think we are ready to start.
You gave the okay?
Yeah, he had thumbs up. So, hello. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon of a series of lectures under one theme, which Ricardo and I'm Nannette, will quickly introduce. Then we have our four speakers showing their work and also, of course, speak related to the given theme. And at the end, we will have a table discussion, also hopefully together with you, debating around the theme. But first of all, we would like to thank the director of the school, Brett Steele, for his constant support and enabling this lecture to be held. And of course, we want to thank our four guests. One is still missing, but she is on her way. So thank you to Rachel Armstrong, Mike Weinstock, Mark Jarzombek, and Claudia Pasquero for joining us today and accepting our invitation and contributing to the discussion. The event itself, you might know or not, is part of a series of events which we started last academic year. And it's basically around the subjects and themes that we discuss with Intermediate Unit 3 that Ricardo and I are teaching here at the school. And it is, so there will be one more event in spring next year, which will be then the launch of the Inter 3 book. So the series of lectures is building up towards the publishing of the book. So as you know, and as you can see on the screen right now, the theme today is Anthropocene and the Unbuilt. And the question that we are throughout all the events and in the unit always raise is if we can study the environment in architecture without relying on environmental architecture, so without the cliches of solar panels and so on. And those issues are investigated in depth in our upcoming book, as I already said. The book is called Scavengers and Other Creatures in Promised Lands. But exactly that question about the environment and its many implications is that we come today to the specific theme of the Anthropocene. The term Anthropocene marks a new epoch where man's influence on the planet becomes a defining force, as developed by Paul Crutzen in 2002, and afterwards formalized in his article Geology of Mankind. For those of us who split our professional hearts into the certainties of science and the mysteries of fiction, we can recall novels by Olaf Stapleton, Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, where planetary mass is interwoven with the development of man, or the anthropos of an Anthropocene. In order to discuss the angle in which we would like to investigate the Anthropocene, or the white elephant in the room of architecture and the environment, we would like to start with an anecdote of one of our unit trips back in 2012.
So as Nannette is saying, this is a scene of one of the visits we did to the Amazon in 2002 in the state of 2012, the state of Amazonas in Brazil. So in this trip to the north of Brazil, we visit together with our students the town of Velho Airão. Located 6 hours by boat upriver the Rio Negro, the now almost fully abandoned town was once an administrative center for the once profitable rubber trade in the region. Operating as a checkpoint for controlling the trade in the upper region of the River Negro, the town was suddenly abandoned. The first explanation for Velho Airão demised, and the most popular account in the region is the fire ants took over the town. Somehow, with their fierce and fast strategy, they drove the population out into a new city that they had to found called Novo Iron. So, New Iron. Velho means old. Uh, Although appealing, the second explanation, the most probable one, is economical. As soon as the rubber trade decreased in the region, the town lost its purpose. It became an abandoned outpost in an otherwise wet, humid, and malaria-filled environment. It certainly did not offer the zone of comfort expected by administrative city folks used to Manaus. Manaus at that time was called the Paris of South America, due to a price of rubber that was more expensive than gold. Visiting the area in 2012, we could see ruins of buildings made out of bricks and mortar engulfed by thick vegetation and the house of its only inhabitant, Nakayama, a Japanese-born man raised in Brazil. The approximately 20 square meter wood hut display his survival tools, including machete, plastic boots, cap, and a massive satellite dish in which he watched the Club World Cup final, Corinthians versus Chelsea, playing in Tokyo.
And the reason for telling this tale of Nakayama is to help us approach the theme of today's symposium, because in a contained small town, it discusses preconceptions and concepts and realities of how human, economy, culture, and the forest form part of a tale of cycles. The enlightening thinker Giambattista Vico, while discussing the mythological creation of Rome in his book New Science, established an evolutionary formula of sorts in which first came forest, and out of the forest came the hut, then the city, and finally the academy. He wrote, this was the order of human institutions, first the forests, after that the hut, then the villages, next the cities, and finally the academies. Going even further, he elaborates the nature of peoples in first crude, then severe, then benign, then delicate, finally dissolute.
So again, in this very interesting quote from Vico, New Science book from the 18th century, is that in that sequence of progress out of nature, the hut as the first step into culture culminate not only in the city and the village, but in the academy, the place where rational thinking is exercised and where the power of abstraction and science lifts mankind towards the light above his rooted, earthly, wet beginnings under the dark canopy of the forest. According to Robert Harrison, Giambattista Vico thought that once that progress and enlightenment was interrupted by war or famine or natural disasters, we will return to the forest state, perhaps like Nakayama or the forest in Velho Airão. Go backwards somehow, away from the lightening of patriarchal gods living in heaven into the humid soil of Mother Earth, where we're coming from, in some sort of massive regress towards barbarism. And its symbol, the forest. But as mentioned by Robert Harrison, global warming might just deny us that comfort, thought, as the cyclical return from academy to forest, as it might not happen after all. So perhaps after climate change, the return to the forest state in this cyclical term might not just happen. Instead, the environment might most likely morph into a much more inhospitable space for the human species, above 50 degrees Celsius. Resource extraction towns, similar to this one, the north of Bangalore, illustrates very well the uneasy shift between economic organization of space, urban formations, and its winding down trends of abandonment and leftover environmental terrains in those urbanisms. Infrastructures and city divisions lose weight to other criteria, like the continuous time-based transformation of what we call built environment. But as Gaia hypothesis proposer James Lovelock describes in his new book, Rough Ride to the Future, invention and intuition are also equally or more important than science in the context of planetary climate change. And in today's event, we will discuss not only the Anthropocene as an apocalypse like the biblical revelation, but also another type of apocalypse, connected with the uncovering of cycles, rebirth, invention, and architectural design. So as you know, in mythology reading, you have apocalypse as deliverance, and also the apocalypse as an uncovering as a rebirth cycle. So there's this perhaps two trends that we interesting to investigate, not just as films like 2012. And architectural design as active parts in the process of thinking the scale of our new collective home. This afternoon, we maybe accept the suspension of disbelief, from science to fiction, and equally from fictional poetic to science. We will hear about notions of emergency, cities of hope and resilience, the incredible opportunities and challenges in transiting from inert to living architecture, but also cautious tales of what we call anthropos on Anthropocene might mean in the global age. Those images from this quarry and the next quarry are incredible because they are the leftovers of urbanism or mining. In both cases, you might ask yourself, what comes first, the city or the mine? What determines the growth of the city or the mine? So in both cases, you have a very interesting example that the leftover is just the architecture of the cosmology. It's just the architecture of symbol. It's just the temple. And both quarries are getting mined around those symbols. In that build-up of ideas and perspectives, we should begin as the clock ticks and goodwill might transform into skepticism. Our first guest speaker will be Mike Weinstock. Mike is the founder and director of Emergent Technologies and Design Programs in the Graduate School of the Architecture Associations. Over the last decade, his published work has arisen from research into the dynamics, forms, and energy transactions of natural systems and the applications of the mathematics and process of emergence to cities, to groups of buildings within cities, and to individual buildings. Whilst his principal research and teaching has been conducted at the Architecture Association, he has published and lectured widely and taught seminar courses, studios, and workshops on these topics at mainly other schools of architecture in UK, Europe, United States, and Japan. So please, help us welcome Mike Weinstock.
Hello. My name is Mike, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the way we think about cities and some of the questions that I think are pertinent and I think many of you will share. And I want to start by pointing out the first utopia, the first vision of it, was a small city. And what I want to address is a number of the ideas that are about cities, a number of architects who have proposed. I'm going to go a really fast gallop through about 100 years. Okay. And this is the first and most important quote of, in my... You can't hear me? You can hear me. Okay. So this is about 100 years ago, a little more now. Every generation will have to build its own city. And that's as much a project of the imagination as it is of science. And I'm going to show you one or two examples of young architects like you who, over the last 100 years, have proposed ideas about the city. Some in architectural drawings, but some in films, some in books. And my favorite quote the one that stays with me, it's from Levi Strauss, Trees Tropiques. And he's talking about the ville, which if you speak pure French, you will say is a town, but for this, we'll say is a city. That it's both real and imaginary, something lived and something dreamed. And he also said that when we build cities, we build our biological history into them. And I will talk a little bit more about that. This image is from 1914. I think Santilia was about 23 years old at the time, 22 or 23, died a year later in the First World War. And what he was talking about in these, I think, quite amazing drawings that prefigure the world as it is today, he's talking about an architecture of calculation, of speed, of movement. He took his inspiration and suggested others did from the mechanical world. But I think most importantly for us, this is the first and most comprehensive vision of the cities that we live in today, and also prefigures most of our modes of design and thinking about it. So one particular aspect of Metropolis I'm going to talk about are the components and how they were envisaged and the legacy that we live in and that we still struggle to eliminate from our thoughts and to move on from. Okay. So first of all, 1 million people in a city, although that sounds kind of amazing for 19, was actually achieved about 5,000 years ago. Okay. So it's not at all true that 1 million plus is a kind of modern density. In fact, nowadays we'd regard it as fairly low density. But you can, this is Hilbersheimer, who was a good socialist at that time. And you can see pretty much a rather sweet separation. These kind of little dotty things down there, I think, are vehicles, and pretty much the infrastructure, including the commerce, is all kind of buried below that. And the people live in these lovely blocks. And if you want to see the scale of those and how scary that is, they're 600 meters long. And that is the vision of the city. Not at all uncommon at that time. More famously, Corbusier. Corbusier being French has to be bigger and greater than anyone else, so it's 3 million. But pretty much the same kind of diagram. And the important thing about this is, where would we be? The ordinary people are right out here in the periphery. It's the elite in the center. And this idea stays with us and is still present. And that kind of rather nice white cross in the center is the airport. Pretty impractical today. Blanvoisin was funded by and named after automobiles, and you can still see, although nominally a different plan for a piece of Paris, the same sets of ideas of large towers for the social and economic elite, and progressively smaller, with some good qualities of garden squares and so forth, for a hierarchical society. So the further out you lived, the less important you were. We still have this problem. London now has planning policy for what they call key workers, because they've realized if you push all poor people out of the city, there's no one left to work the city. So firemen, policemen, nurses, the guys who empty your bins, all of this. And there it is. In film, architects are fairly unquestioning about this, but in film we start to see the first kind of dystopian anxieties expressed. That whilst we dream about the city, we fear it, and we fear it as an instrument of social oppression. And if you had qualified in those days as young architects, you might have been one of those guys working on the model. Amazing physical model, built by artisans, some of whom were young, recently qualified architects, and there was no work at the time for architects. And there are two other things I'd like to mention about Metropolis. First of all, everyone should see it, but there are two important things I think that are critical for us today. The first is a kind of fetishization of technology, erotic in this case. I don't know if all fetishes are erotic. Are they? Perhaps they are. Some are fearsome. And the second thing, of course, is that the person who rules and runs the city is an architect. Also a villain, as we will see. Hugh Ferris, these are amazing drawings. If anyone ever gets a chance to see them, they're as large as I am, even bigger. Done by hand with graphite rather than pencils. And what we see from these are the development and extension of the ideas that we saw earlier on with Santilia. Cities of movement, massive buildings, far beyond the scale of a person or comprehensible. And the beginning of a kind of fetishization of the relationship of objects and movement systems, infrastructure. They're quite beautiful, so don't misunderstand me. I love and admire them as drawings. But many people took these also at the time and since then as warnings of the futures of cities. And pretty much we can see the contemporary metropolis here. It's a model, of course, but physically almost everything that we think of as present in today's cities are present here. And this is from 1930. Shape of Things to Come has a very strange kind of dialogue, so I'm not going to run the film clips today because it's in this very stilted language that we would find hard to understand. Many of the big hotels you've stayed in have lobbies like this as a kind of interior vision, these kind of large, white, semi-articulated spaces and vast crowds of people where there are no individuals. It's anonymity is becoming part of the discourse and anxieties of the city. A little later, we start seeing ideas about the garden city. And Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, most famously, Broadacre City. So Frank Lloyd Wright, almost simultaneously, is very rapidly transiting between high-density cities for the elite and a much more egalitarian idea where every family has their own acre. And this kind of extends across the landscape, no natural boundaries. The one proviso he makes is there's only one person who's qualified to run a city like this, and that's him, or the architect, you guys. And we can see from this, he's got quite sweet, interesting flying machines, kind of early sci-fi look to it. Hilbersheimer emigrated to the US at the end of the war. Just before, he very rapidly becomes a good capitalist, but he does take up the idea of the decentralized city. He actually did some very important and very good work, I think, on the Chicago master plan. So the kind of modification of the ideas is there. But in principle, what's happening is the very dense city is just being spread out. The components are the same. You can see a little more clearly in this drawing. So that the components remain the same. They're organized around the infrastructure system. There are fewer high-rises, but they look an awful lot longer. There are no measurements in these early drawings. And again, there's this kind of extension of an endless plane of medium density dwellings. No public spaces that we can see or articulate or understand from that. And the height of this movement, we see beginnings of a number of films that are starting to attack the idea of the architect and his dominance. But probably the one that's most in praise of the architect as an individual is this one, which is The Fountainhead. Very important novel in US history. The architect is this very handsome, distinguished man. In the book, there's a lot of talk about him when he can't get work. As an uncompromising man, he doesn't want to deal with clients who won't build exactly what he wants, goes to work in a rock quarry. So he establishes, Hollywood has established the myth of the architect as the rebel, the purist, whose ideas just can't be compromised.
It's my duty as your dean to say you will never become an architect. I am an architect.
Okay. Yeah. He doesn't care what anyone says. Yeah. And most famously, he designs what we would think of, it's a Hollywood vision of a modernist tower. And the owners employ another architect, lesser talented in the film, to kind of stick on the front some classical porticos and bits and pieces. And he breaks into the building site in the middle of the night with dynamite and blows the whole thing up. Okay, so we still have that. And as a student of architecture, I also thought, this is my stuff, I'm doing this, I'm going to do these, everyone's going to build it. I think I'm making fun of it, but in another way, we still struggle with this kind of myth of the creative architect whose only job is to work and demonstrate his or her genius. Relationships to clients, to users, to people inhabiting buildings, to what happens to the land and the city around it are irrelevant in that. In Europe, we start to see in the 60s beginnings of what would become a very famous movement, the Situationists, which is accepting the city as it is and working with encounters and using those kind of personal encounters and personal trajectories and events as a way of reconfiguring concepts of the city. And in Constantine's work, the early Situationists, he talks about a kind of nomadic life, and people wandering through cities. And we still see this, most famously in New York Stories, New York Trilogy, Paul Auster. It's still present in literature of the city. And there are huge labyrinthine interiors. The models are very nice. I have a copy of the original film if anyone wants to get it. I don't know what the copyright situation is, so we can pass a stick around next week if someone comes to my room. And what's most remarkable about the model in the film is there are no people in it. And again, it's these kind of structures, systems, but the absence of people. Very famous when I came here as a student, although I came much later, machines have started to come alive in science. Architects, again, fairly slow to take up those ideas. In mainstream science, you already had well-established cybernetic systems for what were for architects then very advanced computation. And this is the walking city from Archigram. Something quite different happening in Japan, Makenzo Tanji, the Metabolist movement. But astonishingly, for all the rhetoric, the central idea of this is identical to Hildesheimer and is identical to Santilia. We have multiple modes of representation and development in the 20th century, but the ideas are remarkably persistent, as are the anxieties. So here we have a central spine. What is beneficial about it in terms of we hadn't seen it in others is the incorporation of what we think of as the fabric of ordinary life, the place where your children go to kindergarten, the hospitals and schools and parks are all strongly aligned around the infrastructure, and the housing systems are kind of out in the bay. And a little bit later than that, towards the end of the 60s, we come to an idea that many of you will have worked on, and I certainly did as a student. I worked on Inhabited Bridge. We're still seeing competitions for that in London, and lots of arguments. But this is the Lower Manhattan Expressway. And you can see again, something we'd find astonishing considering the volumes of traffic today. These kind of rather oddly proportioned, flat, beetle-like things are the cars. Again, the organizational aspects of contemporary life are organized along the spine of infrastructure, and the ordinary people progressively live further and further away. In terms of organization and system organization, he was a remarkable draftsman and made some very amazing images. And there are good architectural qualities, but I'm just concentrating on this persistence of ideas. Not much was built by the Metabolists. The idea is not taken up very much, spread very widely across the world in architecture schools, academies, various theoretical works. This one is probably the best known. I'll show you a kind of really funky one in a little while. These ideas also come, we can see with Corbusier. I don't know if any of you have ever been to these. The one in Marseille is really amazing, and it has a little hotel in it, which is, you can rent rooms and stay there for a couple of days, small apartment. Has nice original staircases inside them by Prouvé. And it is a remarkable thing to see. The English version is a little more impoverished. Smithson's, Robin Hood Gardens. There have been various moves by architects to have this building listed, or this group of buildings. It's quite compromised, surrounded by traffic. Very difficult at the time to get to, and if you lived in it, you'd be extremely socially isolated. Completely unsuitable for English climate and society, and the way society was organized at that time. And that's how it looks now. Well, actually, that's how it looks. We've been taught to hate these kind of things in the public press. In architecture school, the opposite. My first year, Smithson's, where my tutors said, you have to study the Smithson's, you have to go and see the Economist building. Still there, it's a nice building, and one should. But by then, the English public and press had, architects began to have all the social cachet of rat catchers. Everybody hated them, and particularly they hated these kinds of buildings and structures. Not so in Japan, where we see the kind of best of the compression of a whole house down into tiny capsules. A building I always liked as a student, because I came from a shipping background and the top reminded me of a submarine. I never found out if the architect also liked those things. They're steel capsules, very simple structural system. You built the whole apartment in a factory and just took them by crane and kind of plugged them in. And there it is. And it's still in use today by a party of Germans and Japanese who live in Japan, and it's used for raves and various kinds of strange parties and things. So I've never been invited to one, so I don't really know. And it has this kind of character of quite attractive 20th century ruin. So it appears fairly frequently in architectural historical books and tours. Okay. We see a really big change in the 70s in literature. Literature always seems to precede film, of course, but precedes architecture by decades. And Ballard, most of you will know, it's in a compendium of his short stories and in a smaller one called Low-Flying Aircraft. And what he's talking about is the Garden City. And this is not his image, it's just one I've kind of selected. What he's talking about is a marriage of Arcadia and advanced technology. And as you said in your introduction, it's all solar panels and bicycle clips and vegetables, everybody kind of living cleanly. Everything is kind of solved. And the young people hate it. The ones who grow up and live there hate it. And what they dream of is the abandoned metropolis. Abandoned metropolis, from about this period, appears almost every year in some sort of film. It's one of the dominant icons of the city in the late 20th century and early 21st century. And he dreams of going there and seeing this thing. And he imagines it being occupied. And he finds there are some people who still live there, and one of them who still lives there is the architect who used to run the city. And what he dreams of is, with a small group of fellows, is reanimating it by wiring up mixers, toasters and refrigerators. He wants all the neon, he wants all the kind of noise of and light of what he sees as making the city alive. And again, this is really significant in our terms, on a positive side, that what is often the invisible infrastructure, that he wants to make it visible of the city, and less positively, that it's not to do with bringing people back. It's just a visible detritus and power systems. New York City figures a great deal for two reasons, I think. First, because the city has a very enlightened policy to filmmakers, and they will clear some streets and allow you to make films there, provided you pay large amounts of money. This is from I Am Legend. And the second reason, I think, is perhaps a subtext or subconscious, that Manhattan, for my generation, maybe not for yours, was always the iconic city. When people talked about the city, if you lived in the provinces or you lived in the country, it was always images of Manhattan that counted. We always thought in the UK and other places that I lived in that Manhattan was incredibly dense because it had very tall buildings, and it wasn't until I visited and worked there that I began to realize actually most of the people live around it, what they call the bridge people, and it's a vast commuter city. Still an amazing place to go and see. This was called the City of Darkness. I saw this as a child. My father took me there. He was also fascinated by these things. Famously at the time, no European could enter it because it was considered too dangerous. And before it was abolished, no policeman would voluntarily enter it. When you look at the original buildings, and you see how much they've been altered and colonized by people, holes punched between buildings, additions, small bridges, connecting things. It wasn't designed or built like that. So there were thousands of changes that were made, undrawn, without any kind of permission. And it was said that you could pass entirely through this thing from one side to the other without ever touching the ground. The density, I don't think there's still anything like that being achieved. It was quite small, 200 meters by a little more than 100, and only 14 high for 35,000 people. So in American terms, that's 3 million people per square mile. Or for us here, 1 million per square kilometer. Okay. The component, the city block, is still largely part of how cities are conceived and planned. And there are some very beautiful and intelligent designs for them. Most of you at some point will do at least one. They say every architect in his life designs a tower and then when you're fed up with that, you turn on to the city block. And it's very ancient, the city block. That's for another lecture, the origins of that. But the reality of what's built is this and this. The drawings that architects go to, that I as a student, and you do too, invest kind of love and care and despair over, often get reduced to that. And the most scary thing of all, when you look at that, is there it is. And that's what's built. And we can abandon this responsibility for this, and we all do. But maybe there's a point to say that our ideas are not sufficiently compelling. No matter how hard we try and what we put forward, we're not convincing people that economically, socially, these are kind of brutal, repressive places. And the world is full of them, and if from a certain light and certain angles, they're very attractive. And what serves them is this. We've forgotten the idea that a city is located somewhere, that it's embedded in a context, a land, a climate. It has a social history and a cultural history that are particular to a place. Highway 5, this is what became of Broadacre City. The acres get divided and divided and divided. Infrastructure, as much as it connects, divides. It's impossible to pass by foot from one side of that to the other. Famously, in parts of Los Angeles, if you want to cross to the other side of the road, you can drive sometimes for 3 or 4 kilometers, in miles, I think, 2 or 3 miles, before you can cross over. And we also forget that for a significant fraction of the world lives like this, with the city in the distance, for the rich, for the others. And most amazingly of all, if anyone's ever been to Mexico City, you can spend days and days and days on little buses going through these things. And it seems to be this kind of unending low to medium density carpet that extends forever. And there's no center, there's no hierarchical organization of any kind. And unless you're a long-term resident, almost impossible to find your way. And the context for this, where does the food and the water and the power and all the things we use come from? In my research and my argument, there's not a single millimeter of the Earth's surface that has not been affected by humans and changed by it. Vast areas are engineered. Some of the engineering systems like this, the rice paddies, are very, very ancient. There are contemporary versions. These have their own beauty and their own power. But increasingly we're seeing this. Greenhouses. Fly into Rotterdam, fly over southern Spain, Almeria. You'll see 20 or 30 kilometer long stretches of greenhouses. That's what, if you had fruit for breakfast, that's probably where it came from. And, you know, my iPhone and my laptop and the way I live costs this. And this. This has a half-life of 500 years before humans can live anywhere close to this. And it's essential for the way we live. So, for your generation, if the UN is right, the time when I showed you, the first drawings I showed, less than 2 billion people were alive. Today it's 7, within your lifetime, very soon, it's going to be 9. We have no idea how we're going to organize the flow of energy and food to do these things. But for you, there will be at least 2,000 new cities built. It's going to be a major area of work and investment and for, I hope, for architects like you. But if you don't, and if you don't have the ideas, they'll build the other things that we say. And the context that you do it in, this is the consensual map of natural systems that are agreed to be in transition. Consensual means it's the one that the smallest number of people quarrel about. That's how we got our prime minister, and if you're American, how you got your president, and it's the least objectionable one. There are more that I think are more precise, but politically less accepted.
I'd like to share a revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I tried to classify your species, and I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment, but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply, and multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague, and we are the cure.
And of course, Smith is pure information. I've written a whole book about this, so I'm not going to go very far with it. Tainter is probably the best if you want to read up on this collapse of Western societies. There's Tainter. But in complex system theory, there are three possible outcomes to any collapse. We're applying this to cities, but it applies to a pile of sand, sugar on your table at 4 o'clock in the morning in a cafe. It applies to any system. And the first is dispersal, and there's some very interesting examples of it. It doesn't mean everybody dies when it collapses, but it's the young that move, the healthy, the old tend to stay where they are. Simplification, which is a scientific word for sustainability. There is, to my knowledge, only one example in the whole of human history of this working, and that's the eastern half of the Roman Empire, after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And they did it by disbanding their army, abandoning money, collecting their taxes in terms of goods, of skins, animals, and so forth, and giving away territories. And it shrank and shrank from 30 million people down to one city, that was then Constantinople, Istanbul today. There's a terrible cost, and it's the least, in my view, the least desirable outcome, and we should not seek it. And complexity, the system gets reorganized. And that's always accompanied by a higher flow through of energy and of information. And if we get it wrong, we become like this. This was once a city on the Silk Road, for its time, one of the most highly connected cities on Earth. Expanded its numbers past the capacity of the area to support it, all the trees cut down, changed the river courses, the land started to change, coupled with climate change. Climate change is not new, it's been here before, we're just making it go a lot faster, and we're adding some nasty chemicals to it. So that kind of combination of overrunning your resources, complexity, because for their time, these were highly complex societies. So large numbers of people used to produce information in their terms, and climate change. climate change always means ecological change. Can't grow their food, animals can't feed on the food, and so forth. And we're not so bad at this. We have our own kind of special techniques that we've added to that. Toxification, radiation. We have some really, really interesting new additions to ways of ruining and then having to abandon cities. So the questions I want to leave you with that are, can we reanimate the city? Can we think of the city not as a place of dread? Can we make a dream of a city that will be convincing to people who are not architects? And my own work has concentrated my own research on cities that are sentient and self-aware. That's not AI in the big AI of imitating human brain, but AI, artificial intelligence, much more to do with systems for collective and distributed intelligence, which insect societies and others make us very good examples for. Can we be more egalitarian in the way cities are dreamed and thought of? That it's for everyone. And there's a couple of things there, slightly more technical. The last one, can we make spatial patterns that are culturally appropriate? And the second point is, the idea that a city grows forever is historically proven to be untrue and is absolutely the worst strategy for coping with climate and ecological change and for higher complexity. We have to have cities that are capable of some kind of reconfiguration. And the final point I want to make is not a question, but a small, what I hope you will remember, a small reminder. Architecture is what you do with other people and for other people. And as long as we're only talking to ourselves, we shouldn't be surprised if the world outside changes completely and that we have no part in that future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
I'll take my glasses.
Next speaker coming up is Rachel Armstrong. Rachel is a professor of experimental architecture in Newcastle University, and she innovates and designs sustainable solutions for the built environment using advanced new technologies such as synthetic biology and smart chemistry. She received the Trend Watchers of the Year award in this year, 2015, and is a 2010 Senior TED Fellow. Rachel's book, Vibrant Architecture, Matter as Co-Designer of Living Structures, explores prospects for transformations of matter into habitable structures, which prompts a re-evaluation of how we think about sustainability in our homes and cities. Please welcome Rachel.
Well, thank you very much. I also wasn't sure if that all stuck together or whether you needed a... Is it going in there? Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So, just wait for it. Oh, it looks like something's happening. Sound? No, I'm just trying to get the image up there. I think it's got to be mirroring, hasn't it? Displays. Detect displays. Shoot. Do I need to?
It's automatically so
Yeah.
One second plug in.
Okay. I didn't put it out.
Yeah.
You can just drag it to the other side.
That's one. Nearly there. So I just needed to come out first.
to do something very, and then kind of control. If I can start from, just get the mouse to start there.
Are you able to control this position?
Well, I mean, I can click the button as long as I can see the
Yes,
screen.
Okay.
So if I just do slideshow, how
You just
does
need to look on the other side too.
Yeah.
how does that? You can get the first slide up, and I can just give you.
Yeah,
how
Ricardo,
did you do that?
I think I know how to fix it. If
Okay,
you want to
it's
see
okay
it
now.
both on your screen. Oh, no, it's fine. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Phew, we got there.
It's okay.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Well, first of all, I want to thank Ricardo and Nannette for asking me to come and give a presentation today and say hello to Claudia. And my talk really is about the historic relationship between architecture and life. And really what I intend to do is to go through a brief history of life and really take a very material basis to the discussion really about what are the architectural materials of the third millennium that are most compatible with our ideas of what life actually is, and are we using the right materials if we want to embody living processes in architecture, and if we're not, then what might those materials be? So I'm just pointing out that I'm taking a material perspective of this, you know, in contrast to the urban perspective and informational perspective that we've just heard. And so, I mean, essentially, since Aristotle, the city's been likened to an organism. And during Middle Ages, the body itself was used as a unit of measurement, as a kind of blueprint for buildings. And we had the inch, the top of the thumb, the yard, the distance between the hand and the elbow, the foot, quite literal. I mean, so essentially, you know, the body was embedded in the idea of space. And with the Renaissance, we had this introduction of the imagination, where we now started to create metaphorical relationships between the production of architecture and other forms of life and living. So biology becomes a very significant trope, you know, like with the rise of detailed buildings with great organic-like designs, you know, particularly in the late Gothic style. And with the advent of modernity and industrialization, we took a different approach to the idea of biology, nature, and life. And I'll talk about that in a little while. And that's the idea of the modern synthesis, where it becomes incredibly mathematical and actually rather reduced. And the impacts of this framework have actually been devastating when played out on a global scale. And now we're probably all aware that the production of modern architecture has led to a footprint that's about 40% of the carbon that's produced on the planet, because of the way that buildings not only are built, but also the way that they're used. So the bad news is that the way that we produce architecture is reverse terraforming the planet. The good news is, because of its scale, that small changes in the way that we change the way that we produce and inhabit space can actually have significant impacts. And it's this global scale critique that's being articulated by Crutzen and Sturmo in this idea of the Anthropocene. And nowadays we all accept that, particularly in the modern era, there is a global scale impact of human living on the natural world. But Donna Haraway, in a really great video that's online that I'd recommend that you all see, called the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and Thulucene, observes in the mythos associated with the Anthropocene, which she summarizes in two great images. One is that of the Burning Man, this is just a modern city. The one is the Burning Man, in which the idea of humans being burned through their consumption of fossil fuels is one of those tropes that is driving society. And the other one that she raises is more of a feminine counterpoint, and that is the image of Gaia, the idea of the pale blue dot being almost like an organism, or as Buckminster Fuller would say, a spaceship, in the vast void of the cosmos. So Haraway observes that the Anthropocene is a rather negative mythos, that it ends with extinction scenarios. So if we have a good Anthropocene, we end up being extinct through the replacement by hyper-intelligent machines. And if we have a bad Anthropocene, we end up being extinct through the Great Sixth Extinction. And really, she asks, why are we playing this game? What's with this mythos of extinction? Is there another way of thinking about the existence of humanity and how we might have a sense of ongoingness, how we can actually get through this period where we're so hyper-aware that our actions on global scale are having an incredibly negative impact on the planet and on ourselves. So this idea of the Thulu scene, what is it? The Thulu scene is inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's notion of the god Thulu, the guy with the big cephalopod face. And he's really a nice character. I don't think Haraway particularly wants to invoke his behavior, but actually the tentacles that characterize him. And she calls this the multiple ones. And so she gathers together a portfolio of deities and tropes that start to speak of multiplicities. So that would be people like Melissa, Queen of Bees, the goddess that embodies the swarm. She also invokes the notion of biofilms, embryology, climate change, these hyper-complex entities that defy this idea that they can be solved through the tools of modern synthesis on which our modes of construction in the modern age are based. So let me just talk about that for a little. So the last century, the 20th century, is probably the pinnacle of Enlightenment thinking. It's been about 500 years in the making. The father of the modern scientific method, Francis Bacon, imagined this city, a utopia called New Atlantis, which was actually based around the modern laboratory. And if you look at the image of New Atlantis, a drawing that was published around about 1624, you'll actually see the seeds of contemporary cities. You'll see communication systems, you'll see advanced optics, and you'll even see genetic modification. So the ideas that we've been working with and the tools of science and technology have really been around for about 500 years, and they're underpinning the way that we work and the way that we think. So really this idea of the Thulu scene, or what I would call the eco scene, is an opportunity for us to think about how we're thinking, what kinds of tools we're using, what kinds of materials are available to us, and really start to experiment with alternative perspectives. And so this idea of the tools of modern synthesis really start to reach their peak around about the 1930s. And let's say modern synthesis really applies to the idea of biology as being a phenomenon that can be described by mathematics. And the Fibonacci spiral is, of course, a trope for that. The idea that the Fibonacci spiral underpins the production of shells like this one in the picture. Now, that doesn't mean that the Fibonacci spiral or the sequence can't describe this spiral. The question is actually, does nature actually think in those terms? Does nature actually work with mathematics, or are we imposing mathematics on the expressions that we would consider to be part of the natural world? And so this notion of the modern synthesis is actually quite comparable to the idea of Newtonian physics in physics. You know, it's got this very typical set of ideas, which is about hard inheritance, adaptation by natural selection, centrally driven cell processes, and the top-down control of genes. And of course, over the last century, we've had exceptions to the rule, such as Charles Waddington, who paved the way for systems biology. And even Alan Turing himself, the father of modern computing, was very aware that his digital form of computation was a simplification of natural processes. You know, and he was actually very interested in how nature itself computed. And then we also had the Russian biologists, perhaps most notoriously experienced through the direction of Lysenko. And although it was rich in ideology, it was much less rigorous in its experimental methods. And the Russians, around the turn of the last century, were very interested in the idea of cytoplasm as opposed to the nucleus, because it was a connector. It ideologically embodied the idea of a collective. And people like Bogdanov, who was the founder of the idea of the blood transfusion, was somebody who was looking to find the connecting substance, almost like an aquavita of life. So the idea of transferring one connective fluid from one body to the other was actually part of their rhetoric, their thinking, and why they actually explored that kind of idea about living and life in their experimental work. But actually, for most Western biologists, the modern synthesis provided and provides a useful foundation for research. I'm not knocking the modern synthesis. I'm just saying that when it gets to hypercomplexity, as Haraway's observing, the tools themselves start to show weaknesses, and we need to think of how we might start to re-engage with those gaps and find opportunities and places for innovation and the production of new kinds of architectures. So essentially, it's now abundantly clear that the way that cells work is highly complex. It is not simply a single program working from the inside, instructing a set of organic molecules how to be. There's a very complex set of entanglements that living things have with their environment, and many of them can't be simply modeled or described. So Haraway's provocation, I think, is really a bit like this old, I think it's a Hindu poem, but John Godfrey Sachs actually started to write about this idea in the 19th century, and that was this legend of 6 wise blind men and the elephant. So each of them, very, very wise men, are led to the elephant which they can't see, and they're all given a different part of the elephant to describe. So they start to describe it as a rope when they hold the tail, as a tree when they hold the leg, as a wall when they feel the side of the elephant, or a snake when they hold the trunk, or a fan when they hold the ear. And in some ways, all of the wise blind men are right, but all of them are wrong. And this is the nature of the third millennial challenge that we have. If we think about Timothy Morton's notion of the hyper-object, objects that are so large and so diffuse that we can no longer observe them in their entirety. So Haraway's notion of this Thulu scene starts to engage with this complex question of things that are so multiple, so heterogeneous, so huge, so unfathomably complex that we cannot possibly, through one single set of tactics, begin to handle all the multiple factors. And I would say that we've become aware of this incredible challenge, probably with the advent of the internet, whereby we're starting to see the overlapping and transgression of previously circumscribed boundaries like geographies, cultures, disciplines. And now we're faced with this incredible portfolio of different perspectives, some of which are paradoxical, some of which are contradictory, and these are all stacked up against each other. And I think what would define the eco-scene for me is actually not a hegemonic replacement of the industrial with the ecological, but actually how we navigate these competing alternative realities. How do we actually bring together all the knowledge sets that we have available to us and navigate through them so that we can find the opportunities for radical resynthesis, radical revisionings, and to open up new spaces for the imagination and for architectural practices. So essentially, these kinds of phenomena that we're looking at start to speak through the language of molecular biology. Now, although molecular biology originates from the modern synthesis, we've actually reached a point in the third millennium where we're actually understanding that let's say, the abstracted and rather simplified ideas that we had at the beginning of last century are becoming way more complex. And we're actually given a set of tools and approaches and ideas that we can start to mash together again. So I would say that at the third millennium, we're starting to look at a new biology that deals with hypercomplexity, that isn't centrally driven, that isn't Richard Dawkins' notion of simple competition, even though he does use competition very liberally as an idea, but actually how we can knit together ideas that we find in genomics, bioinformatics, metabolic design, evolutionary genetics, and all the kind of rich insights that modern biology has given us. How can we take all these ideas and go beyond biomimicry, which is drawn from the modern synthesis, to create an environment in which, Kevin Kelly's notion of the realm of the born, all that is nature, and the realm of the made, all that is humanly constructed, can become one. And so these expressions are becoming manifest in not just biomimicry, but in a range of biotechnological tools. And they're giving us a new set of biological building blocks for life, not just the steels and the glass facades and the rammed earths and earths that have been made lifeless by our processing, but actually a range of building blocks that are actually embodying life itself. And designers have already started to respond to these opportunities. So we have fashion designer Iris van Herpen here, working with the magnetic properties of materials in order to produce fabrics. She was doing this as it was much faster than rapid prototyping. We have people like Skylar Tibbets and his four-dimensional printing techniques, where molecular structures and human scale structures can twist and warp with the addition of fluids. We've got Henk Jonkers, who's looking at bioconcretes, whereby spores of bacteria become activated when there's a crack in a material, which lets water in, which creates the possibility of metabolism. And those bacteria then produce calcium carbonate, which reseals the crack. And we got people like Neri Oxman, who are using robots to create a silk pavilion, but in concert with the silkworms that do this as a natural activity too. And of course, more functionally within medicine, we're starting to produce bioscaffoldings that colonize and or become colonized by cell cultures to grow three-dimensional 3D printed organelles. So if we're to piece together the opportunities and make different kinds of navigational tools and building blocks for construction that apprehend the nature of our situation and also create a different portfolio of strategies than traditionally. Again, this is not to say that all of a sudden we're all going to become biotechnologists, but it's actually how we can thread these through the existing knowledge sets and production practices that we currently have and start to open up innovative spaces. So what are these strategies for life? So I think they're deeply interwoven with the quality and of thinking and the kinds of tools in which they're embodied. So if we think about ancient times, the architecture, the life of an architecture is expressed through manual labor, a kind of a ritualistic inhabitation, and artisan practices as physical forms of clays and inert materials. And the quality of the craft speaks to the gods and to the afterworld, and to the natural world as a kind of living language through barrows and pyramids and gardens and palaces and archives. And by modern times, of course, industrial production methods and inert materials allow us to consider life potentially as something that seeks permanence and immortality. And towards the third millennium, as observed by the Anthropocene, this colonization of the living Earth's surface by inert things is starting to take its toll. So if you think of the proportion of the Earth's habitable surface that is covered by cities, which is somewhere around about 3%, and the proportion of habitable places on the Earth that is colonized by fertile soils, ones you don't have to add fertilizers to, it's very comparable. It's about 3%, depending on which source of reference you use. So essentially, when we build a city, we build on the world's most fertile soils, because that's where productivity is at its greatest, so particularly around our deltas. And the first thing we do nowadays is to concrete over them or smother them with tar macadam. And we're not replenishing our soils. If we throw away a banana skin into a city street, it will take a huge amount of time more to decay than it would in the countryside, simply because we're depleting the earths in our cities of their natural bacteria. That doesn't mean that there are not other species that are creeping into brown sites, but they're not the same kinds of ecosystems or soil-based ecosystems that allow fertility, promote biodiversity, and actually create the infrastructures for life. But I don't want to dismiss modern architecture. I think that would be very foolish. I think we need to think of how we identify those kinds of opportunities. And so if we think of industrial architectures as really being the mineralized bones of a possible space, how might we generate the infleshings around it that then have potentially a performance that is more conducive with the natural world? And this is, of course, Terraform's meat house here. Now, again, out of the modern synthesis, we've actually become rather impressed and obsessed by DNA as being a programming language and the materials that it produces, which are mainly proteins. Now, the trouble with proteins is that they're incredibly energy expensive from a biological perspective, and actually also from an economic perspective. So tissue culture costs in the region of $1,000 for 3 square centimeters of skin. So to create the terraform model at a human habitable scale is almost unaffordably expensive to carry out in maybe a few people could have one of those. I'm sure Apple could. But for most of us, the idea of living inside a meat jerky is probably out of our budget. So whilst what's neat about these systems, though, what's neat about thinking about the strategies of life is actually they engage with a non-equilibrium world. Whereas, let's say, the algorithmic, that's probably the wrong word, but the ideas of modern synthesis engage with a world that's at equilibrium state, and that these are hierarchically ordered objects, whereas the hypercomplexity engages with a fundamental object which is paradoxical in nature. It's like a tornado, and it's called a dissipative system. It's an object that isn't an object. It's an object that is also a process, and it possesses a set of properties that exceed, again, the simple representation through the tools of modern synthesis. So cells in themselves are a form of dissipative structure, which evade the progression towards equilibrium, which is a definition of life that was proposed by Erwin Schrödinger in 1944. And really, how do we actually start to design and engineer with these slippery, metabolic, mobile, changeable systems, which often have a lifespan? And they're not the permanent structures that have been imagined by modernity. So if we look back at the tool set that molecular biology has given us, it just hasn't given us proteins. It's also given us a whole bunch of other materials. It's given us water and fats and carbohydrates. So how might we imagine building and designing with those? Not as a replacement for proteins, but if proteins can only ever really produce small amounts of material because of all the folding that goes into them, how might we also use some of these other building blocks of life that we already recognize? And this really isn't as bizarre as it might sound. I mean, a tree is a complex system of carbohydrates. Sure, it's got nuclei in it, and there's information in there that allows the carbohydrate to be structured and create repeatable forms of synthesis. But actually, the carbohydrate spectrum in a tree ranges from the structural, which is the lignins and the cellulose, to the metabolic, which are the sugars, 3-carbon and 6-carbon sugars, to the recyclable waste products, such as carbon dioxide. So if one thinks about architectures as trees, don't just think about the form, because actually the form in some ways is informing the infrastructure, the passage of water through that organic framework of carbohydrates that allows these multiple syntheses to take shape. And so, whilst wood is making a comeback, particularly because of our concerns with sustainability, we're still killing it, and we're still not really drawing on its innate properties, this capacity to transform one set of carbohydrates into another and recycle them through things like photosynthesis. We get stuck at compartmentalizing some of those events. But really, there's an opportunity through the idea of the, hypercomplexity and going beyond modern synthesis to actually start to connect some of these metabolisms and develop them into webs of synthesis within our living spaces. And this is a very interesting work by Arne Hendricks, the Fatberg. That we actually also have a language of fats. Most of them are actually stuck in probably London's sewer system as great big balls of cholesterol-like, well, cholesterol's actually an alcohol, but these fatty masses that are produced through our waste. And actually one of the systems that I've been working with, the protocell, these artificial cell models, are also made out of fats. And we can think of them more like hormones and transmitter systems that are slow release systems that can lay down, a bit like the ants that Mike Weinstock talked about. They can lay down tracks of things that other processes can actually follow. So the protocell in itself is not the thing, it's not the architecture, but actually as a physiology, as a metabolism, as an ecosystem for design, each one of these building blocks of life, the carbohydrate, fats, proteins, minerals, all play different kinds of roles. So how might we actually start to draw these together to produce integrated structures and spaces that work with the full portfolio of substrates that bring life not just into cities, but into the planetary system that we inhabit. What we need to do is to develop the appropriate infrastructures. Okay, how does a fat work with a protein, work with water, and work with carbohydrate? It needs a circulation. It needs to be able to bring resources into it. It needs to take waste products away from it. And the thing that helped life emerge from the seas, because the sea itself was a medium for structure, was the soil. So the soil brings together air and water, minerals, organic matter, and it creates a spatial relationship between them. And in doing that, it can actually start to restructure relationships to a point where we can build our cities on these soils. But we don't have to be naturalistic about what a soil does. As designers, I think it is more than possible for us to think about how we can not just mimic the functions of soils, but how we could produce super soils, reticular structures, complex systems that mash together different agents, some of them biological, maybe fungi and bacteria and algae, together with a whole bunch of resources that are spatially orchestrated to create new opportunities. So that we can now think about creating cities by imagining our habitats as being soil-producing systems. So if we can make that transition today, we would double the fertility of the earth. So if our natural flourishing soils are 3%, and our cities, which really are not on very good soil now, they used to be, if we could turn our cities into soil-producing systems, I'm not just talking about chucking all our waste into a landfill, but actually how do we spatially think about the relationship between the materials that are formed and are produced by cities, not as waste, but actually as further opportunities, not just for upcycling, but actually the construction of structures that augment the processes of life. So how might we go about doing that? That's all great theory, but how might we actually do this in practice? So at the University of Newcastle, my students have been looking at, let's call them models of soils. We use gels, which are activated, and we look at the patterns produced in them by salts, soluble salts. And we actually look at the precipitation and reprecipitation processes. We look at them in different orientations. We start to think about the progression of matter through these structures. And so really we're starting to articulate the idea of what is a soil. It's, again, if you look in the science books, it'll give you a recipe for a relationship between minerals and organic matter and water and air and particle size and all these other kinds of things that are very physical. But what is it that really makes the soil? And that's one of the questions that we're asking. And as I said, we're starting to think about how we turn these into super soils. And of course, there are proposals now that are starting to think of soils as being organic factories. And so this is an asteroid. And the idea is to mine asteroids for valuable metals like gold by seeding them with bacterial colonies in their own soil-like medium, which means that we don't have to go and build a factory on an asteroid, that we can actually seed them with the bacteria. The bacteria will do the work, and then we harvest the gold produced as wee little nuggets like that. But can we do this at a human scale? I mean, that was one of the first projects that I started to do after I worked on the protocell technology. I worked with Philip Beasley, and this is the Hylozoic ground installation, which was part of the 2010 Architecture Biennale in Venice. And essentially what you're looking at is a cybernetic matrix of relationships between plastic fronds. So we've got swallowing tubes, and we have organs that have spikes underneath their leaves, and they have proximity sensors so that you get shown this spiky underbelly as you start to move through this jungle space. And the first wet soil-like structure is that little yellow dot right in the center of the picture there. And it functions really as an olfactory system and a gustatory system. In other words, this is really like standing inside the inside of a giant nose. Okay, so if you think of all the fronds as being the hairs of a sinus, and the little yellow organs as being smart snot glands, they can taste and smell your presence, and you know that they've done that because they produce an insoluble material in the presence of carbon dioxide. So when you breathe on them, they'll produce a little sculpture which grows over the course of the exhibition. And they can actually reach about the size of your little fingertip. So the challenge in this one was, how do you scale something that you might find in the lab that's only a couple of millimeters in diameter up to something that actually becomes observable by a gallery-going audience. And in this one, we were looking at how protocells might be used at the scale of a city. So this is a Future Venice project. And the idea is to take the programmable little fat-based hormones and chemistries, they're little messenger systems, really. And we fitted them with a mineralizing metabolism. In the laboratory, we'd been able to fit them with a light-aversive metabolism, but we hadn't coupled the two together. So we took this idea and we put tanks around the side of the lagoon. There's a challenge in trying to do anything to Venice because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But we went onto the side of the lagoon and showed how these little pearl-like structures could be produced very quickly and rapidly by the oil-based droplet system. And as we were doing a lot of field studies, we also noticed that the lagoon itself is producing mineralized structures, so these thrombolites, or in Australia, you'd probably call them stromatolites. So these are little mineral islands produced by algae and bacteria. And they form naturally within the lagoon environment. So the idea then was that could we take these little signaling systems made of fat and start to garden where these call them forms of bioconcrete were actually being produced. So rather than just let them run in an unruly way as the biological stones of Venice, was there a way in which we could start to garden and articulate a different kind of architecture using this system, perhaps invoke some aspects of Calvino's Invisible Cities. And this is Future Venice 2. The challenge here really was to think about how we could grow a new island for the city out of problematic materials that are abundant in the lagoon, notably the eutrophication, the fronds of algae and alien species that are all the way through the waterways, and also the amount of plastic waste. So there's about 30,000 plastic bottles that get thrown into Venice's waterways every year by 20 million tourists. And this really was a collaboration with Idea Laboratory and Artwise curators for the 56th Venice Biennale. The work at the front is Claudia's and Marco's from Ecological. And it took the form of 8 tanks in which the curated designers were invited to contribute. And the tanks all grew a species of algae, or actually there were consortia of algae. We got the algae from a range of different sources, some from ponds within the city, some from Claudia and Marco's algae installation there. And we mixed them together with plastics that we'd found on the Lido. There was only about a 10-minute beach trawl. And the idea really was, could we create a natural net from the algae to mop up the plastics? Now, we're not really talking about the macroplastics, which we could remove from the lagoon by other means. What we were trying to do is to speak to similar scales. So the problem is not the big objects, but actually it's the microplastics, the fragments that are broken up into tiny, tiny particles that sit below the surface by the action of sunlight and physical changes by the environment. So actually, in 1.5 of the tanks, we managed to grow an algae biofilm, or an algae and bacterial biofilm, that could actually connect both plastics to these organisms. And so this will form the basis of further research, thinking about how we might use these unwanted growths to actually trawl microplastics out of the water, but then to sink them back into the earth, where they become an island mass. But not only that, to actually form the basis of a resource for future generations. So if you think of the way that chalk is made, it's the accretion of tiny marine skeletons, and they are sunk and processed by nature's natural processing systems. What we don't know is what the future history of plastics is. Okay? Artificial plastics that as we understand them, have only been around for just over 100 years. The first synthetic plastics were made at the end of the 19th century. By 1930s, we have nylon. They really are very new. And so all the plastics in the environment have really been there for less than 100 years. So we don't know how they're going to be transformed by natural processes. And the idea also was that this first, let's call it agglomeration of plastics and algae was not inhabited by humans, because it'd be kind of squelchy and difficult to stand on, but actually genetically modified mosquitoes. Now, this is a real mosquito species, and that's just a drawing of a mosquito that I found on the internet. But Oxitec are actually producing a whole range of genetically modified insects. And this particular species that is invoked in the Future Venice 2 project, or Zanzara Island, the island of mosquitoes, is a tiger mosquito that shreds the X chromosome. So it doesn't eradicate the population. What it does is it drastically reduces it. And it's a challenge because with climate change, the malarial and disease-carrying vectors that are mosquitoes are going to be blown from Africa into mainland Europe. And so really, rather than being a gateway to a new wave of malaria in mainstream mainland Europe, the idea is that potentially Zanzara Island could be a first line of defense by drastically reducing the mosquito load. But can we go beyond this? Now, we're looking at how we might design different kinds of soils. All of those systems I've described, the Future Venice reef-like structure, the gels, the new island, the Hylozoic ground, they're all kinds of different soils. But how far can we go with the design of soils in the production of life? And so this is the Hanging Gardens of Medusa. As you can see, it's reaching freefall. It was a tiered laboratory garden that was sent up into the stratosphere. And on the top, we had these robust biological systems, these cacti. And on the bottom, we had protocells, these forms of mineral life. And the question was, how do we design and engineer the infrastructures to support each of those different life forms, or proto-life forms in this particular case? Well, actually, there's a lot of anxiety about the idea of artificial life. And what this particular experiment showed is actually biological life is a lot more robust than forms of artificial life. So the chance of protocells going rampant, becoming grey goo, is actually very low. Certainly not our samples won't, because essentially the DNA creates an integrity to let's call it the movements and phenomena that we associate with life. So, movement sensitivity, growth, all of that is held together by the 3.5 billion years of evolution of biological systems. So just showed that really as a way of saying, just because we're working with lifelike systems does not mean that they're going to literally run away and take over the earth. And if anything, they need to be very carefully supported and nurtured and coaxed into any kind of functional existence. Mostly, they don't work. I'm really showing you the success stories there. So really, what are we looking at then? We're looking at living cities, maybe an expression of the Thulu scene or the Ecoscene is to think of cities whose fundamental fabrics are those that are shared with us and other life forms: the fats, the minerals, the proteins, the carbohydrates, the vitamins, DNA. I mean, all that stuff. How very, very literally. And these are a couple of drawings by, this is Tarek Keesin, who's produced a drawing of Cappadocia, integrating ideas about biotechnology into it. And this one's by Sandra Prawn and Alexandra Stratimirovich. So, the ideas that, perhaps buildings can become much more flesh-like. But, these are not simply just aesthetic tropes. That living architecture is forged from fertile earths. It sounds more like a stomach than a cacophony of engines. It smells like a body rather than an oil refinery. But they're not mud huts or primitive habitats. They are rich environments that celebrate the poetry of life. They're warm to the touch, and they're shockingly biodiverse. And in fact, the living cities could potentially be accused of having too much life. So by creating the infrastructures and the fundamental systems that allow us to make a transition from the inert to the hyper-complex, potentially to the living, and it starts with the infrastructure, then we have a platform that is an integrator that can start to really help us work with convergence of different tools, techniques, technologies, those that have become available in this era, which we could call the Ecoscene, this stratification of different ideas and skill sets and approaches and disciplines. And I think that we now are in a stage where we can think what might replace the plank of wood, the brick or breeze blocks. And whilst these ventures do require some technological and scientific expertise, they also draw very heavily on design and spatial tactics for their meaningful deployment in architectural contexts. And very interestingly, having worked in both architectural design and origins of life sciences, one of the things that origins of life sciences does not have is a spatial understanding of the kinds of ideas that they approach. So what they may say is that the Wusterhauser theory of iron and sulfur is simply material that's put against a rock and proteins gathering around it. But there's no spatialization of that. There's no concept that says, what protein and what orientation and what rock and how close do they have to be and how many of them are there. It's a very interesting potential relationship. So when we're thinking about the synthesis of life, there's also a great opportunity for architecture to open up and kind of create new opportunities by thinking about notions of life by introducing the spatial qualities in which you are, immersed. And so essentially, I think that, that architecture, rather than simply gathering the tools and perspectives that science has uncovered with the tools of modern synthesis, as a kind of aesthetic practice, I actually think that all of you are placed to actually start to rewrite the history of life in the future. And I think that you have a very powerful portfolio and a position to contribute and really open up our understanding during this millennium. So, thank you very much.